Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here. We are still talking about stroke volume. This is exactly where we left off. And remember, we talked about the end diastolic volume as that starting volume of blood that is entering the ventricle. 70 to 80% is passively moving in, whereas 20 to 30% is moving in when the atria contract. So we can talk about that as like atrial kick. And then the EDV is what you start with, and the ESV is what you get left over, right? So that's talking about like how effective is the heart at like squeezing out all of that blood. Not every single drippy drop gets squeezed out. And so the ESV is what's left over. So if you take your starting and you subtract what you are left with, then you know how much was ejected. And how much was ejected is the stroke volume. You know, ideally we want a pretty good sized stroke volume. So this is getting that blood like really effectively moving through our circulatory system. And so ideally then we need a high starting volume, a high EDV, and we need a low leftover volume, a low ESV. So what we are going to look at next are the specifics around our stroke volume. So we're going to see that there's actually three major characteristics or features that are going to be influencing our stroke volume. So we have what's described as preload, which we've mentioned a little bit, what's described as contractility, which we've talked about a little bit, and what's described as afterload. So we've mentioned all three of these in some level of detail, but let's fill in some gaps. When we talk about the preload, what we're really talking about here is the stretch of the ventricle, And so we would ideally like to have a high preload. Okay, so with the cardiac muscle tissue, the more it kind of is stretched out, the more force it can then generate. So think about, I had to pause so I could run and get a rubber band. I wasn't prepared because it just came to me. When we think about preload, let's think about the rubber band, right? So the more we stretch out that rubber band, like I'm starting to get scared because if I let go, it's going to snap and it might hurt a little bit, right? So when we think about pre-lab, like if we only stretch a little bit and let go, it's no big deal, right? There's not a lot of force that's generated. If we stretch it really far and let go, which I'm not even willing to do because I'm scared. If we stretch it really far and then let go, we're going to generate a whole lot more force. So maybe I can flick it. It went all the way to the wall. Okay. I'm safe from that rubber band. All right. And so that's what we're talking about with preload. Now, how do we get that cardiac muscle tissue really stretched? How do we get it really stretched? We do that by having a high EDV, right? So here, basically, if we have a high EDV in diastolic volume, that's our starting amount of blood, then we get a high preload. And really, we talked about EDV and preload as sort of like the same thing. Now, how do we get a high EDV? If we increase our filling time, then we're going to get a high EDV, which means a high preload. So if we increase our filling time, we have more starting blood, right? And the majority of that filling time, 70 to 80% of the blood that enters the ventricle is passively moving in. So what that means on some level is we need to decrease the heart rate in order to increase the filling time, in order to then increase the EDV, in order to then increase the preload. Now we'll see that again, stroke volume and heart rate can sort of compensate for each other. So if you have a high stroke volume and a low heart rate, you still get like a good movement of blood through the body. So it's okay to have a slower heart rate if you have a good stroke volume. And we'll see that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Another method for increasing your preload is to increase your venous return. Venous return is talking about the blood that's located in your veins. So increasing the blood from the body back to the heart is going to automatically increase your EDV and increase your preload. Now, on some level, increasing your venous return is as simple as contracting skeletal muscle. We'll talk about this more toward the end of our series here, toward our video end of our playlist. But increasing that venous return is talking about just like moving your body. What we're basically talking about here with preload is by increasing our preload, again, we're going to be increasing the stretch of that cardiac muscle tissue. We're increasing the stretch of our cardiac muscle tissue. But remember my rubber band, right? And this is going to increase this next factor, which we call contractility. And so we have this direct relationship between the preload and the contractility. And this is described as the Frank-Starling mechanism. This relationship between preload and contractility. Okay, so just so that we're clear, preload is really related to the stretch of the ventricle, and we would like it to be high. We would like a high preload. We'd like a lot of stretch. That's given us really this ability to have like a more forceful contraction. Okay. Let's take a look next at that contractility. What is that talking about? Contractility is talking about the force of contraction. And we want this to be a high factor. We want that force of contraction to be good, because what we're talking about here is by having a very forceful contraction, more blood leaves the heart and less gets left over. So when we talk about having a high contractility, what we're saying is that more blood leaves the heart and less blood is left over, which is our ESV. So we're getting a higher stroke volume and less ESV. So when we increase our contractility, we're going to decrease our ESV. That's our leftover. Then we've already seen you have this direct relationship where you increase your EDV. That's increasing your preload. That's increasing your contractility. So a high preload increases contractility. So those two are like intimately connected. We'll also see that the sympathetic nervous system, the release of the epinephrine and the norepinephrine is going to increase contractility. And then we'll see that calcium ion also increases contractility. Here we're probably seeing two factors. Number one, you know that calcium ion is involved in that cross bridge formation. We talked about that so extensively at Anatomy and Physiology Part 1 when we talked about skeletal muscles. So that information still applies. But also we'll see that the calcium ion, and we've mentioned this in cardiac muscle, is important in that depolarization and that plateau, that squeeze and hold that the cardiac muscle cells do. And so having more calcium is important for the squeeze and hold, meaning that depolarization part of the cardiac muscle tissue, but then also just like the cross bridge formation itself. If the sympathetic division is going to increase our contractility and the parasympathetic division is the opposite, just kind of make a note of that. So if you increase your parasympathetic stimulation, you're going to be decreasing contractility. You're going to decrease your atrial kick, right? So that's the contractility of those atria. So that right there is decreasing your EDV, which we know is basically like decreasing our preload. And if we're decreasing our preload, we're decreasing contractility. Sorry about that. Okay, so just to be clear again, contractility is the force of contraction, and we want this to be a lot of force in order to get a good stroke volume, in order to get a high stroke volume. The last part of our conversation here is looking at what's described as afterload. And afterload is basically talking about how much the heart has to pump against what's described as peripheral resistance. Now, this value, you want afterload to be a low value. You want it to be easy to get the blood out of the heart, pumping through the arteries, pumping to the capillaries, and then from there moving to the venules and the veins. So you want the afterload to be a small number in order to have a good stroke volume. You want the afterload to have a small value in order to have a high stroke volume. Afterload again is talking about like how hard does the heart have to work in order to overcome any like obstacles in the circulatory system. So we'll see when we decrease peripheral resistance, and we're going to talk more about this in the future. So you'll be able to come back and add into your notes. Then you decrease your afterload. Just like at this moment, we can think in terms of like blockages, because we sort of already have this idea that you don't want blockages in your circulatory system. If you have a lot of blockages, you have a lot of peripheral resistance. It's hard to get the blood to move. That's a high afterload, right? And so the opposite of that is like the path is clear. There's no obstacles. That's a low peripheral resistance. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's a good place for us to think right now. If you increase like damage, this can be damage to either like a blood vessel, or it can be damage to the semilunar valve. This is going to increase your afterload. So this is one way of creating like obstacles to getting that blood to move through. Okay, so to be clear, when we talk about afterload, we're talking about how easy or hard it is to get that blood to move through the circulatory system. And ideally, we want that afterload to be a low value. We ideally want that afterload to be a low value. All right. When we talked about stroke volume initially, I think we mentioned our typical range. This is not a value that I want us to memorize, but it's just kind of like a FYI. We see typical range in our stroke volume as 55 to about 100 milliliters. And remember, this is just one factor in cardiac output. Stroke volume is just one factor in cardiac output. The other factor is heart rate. So that's up next. As always, stay tuned and take care of yourselves and each other.